The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. on November 15th, 1962. Dean Martin reached for it with the automatic reflex of a man who'd received too many late-night calls in his lifetime. But the voice on the other end made his blood turn to ice. "We got your friend," the gravelly voice said, "the one who thinks he runs this town. You want to see Sinatra alive again? You bring $1 million to the desert, come alone, no cops, no FBI. One word to anyone, and Frank becomes fish food." The line went dead. Dean Martin sat in his Beverly Hills bedroom holding a silent phone, staring into the darkness. Frank Sinatra, his best friend, his brother, the man who'd stood by him through every triumph and failure, had been taken by the very people they'd tried so hard to avoid. And now Dean Martin faced an impossible choice: risk his own life to save Frank, or lose the only man who truly understood him forever. Frank Sinatra was in the best mood Dean had seen him in months. They were at the Copa Room in the Sands Hotel, just finishing their evening show on November 14th, 1962. The crowd had been electric, responding to every joke, every song, every casual aside between the two men who had revolutionized Las Vegas entertainment. "You know, Dino," Frank said, loosening his bow tie as they walked off stage together, "nights like this remind me why we do this. Not for the money, not for the fame, for that feeling when everything clicks." Dean smiled and lit a cigarette. "Easy for you to say, Pally. You hit every note tonight. I was just along for the ride. Don't give me that humble routine. You know exactly what you bring to this partnership." They had no way of knowing that three men in dark suits had been watching them from the back of the room all evening, or that those same men were now following Frank's limousine as it pulled away from the sands. Vincent the Fish Torrino had been planning this for months. Frank Sinatra had cost him money, respect, and most importantly, face. The previous summer, Frank had refused to perform at a private party for Torrino's associates in Chicago. When Torrino sent his men to persuade Frank to reconsider, Frank had publicly embarrassed them at the Fontainebleau in Miami, calling them cheap hoods in expensive suits in front of 200 witnesses. For a man like Vincent Torrino, respect was everything, and Frank Sinatra had stolen his. But this wasn't just about revenge. Torrino was in deep financial trouble. Several of his gambling operations had been shut down by the FBI, and he owed dangerous people dangerous amounts of money. $1 million from Frank Sinatra or from his friends would solve a lot of problems. The plan was simple: grab Frank, demand ransom, disappear. What Torrino hadn't counted on was Dean Martin's loyalty. Frank's limousine was stopped at a red light on Desert Inn Road when the attack happened. Two cars boxed him in while a third rammed the rear. Before Frank's driver could react, masked men were pulling open the doors. "Don't move, don't scream, don't be a hero," one of them hissed at Frank. Frank, ever the fighter, started to resist. "Do you idiots know who you're messing with? I've got friends who'll hunt you down like animals." That's when they hit him. The blow to his head wasn't meant to kill him, just to shut him up. Frank slumped forward, blood trickling from his scalp. They dragged him from the limousine and threw him into the back of a waiting sedan. His driver, Tommy Reeves, lay unconscious on the pavement. He would wake up in a hospital 3 hours later with a concussion and no memory of the attack beyond the initial impact. Dean Martin had been home for exactly 43 minutes when the phone rang. He'd poured himself a nightcap and was flipping through a script his agent had sent over. Jan was already asleep upstairs. "We got your friend." The voice was calm, controlled, almost businesslike. But there was something underneath it, something cold and final that made Dean's stomach drop. "Who is this?" Dean asked, though he already suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "The guy who's going to make you rich boys understand that this town has rules. Your buddy Sinatra forgot that. Now he's going to remember. You want him back? You bring $1 million, small bills, tomorrow night." "How do I know Frank's alive?" There was a pause. Then Frank's voice came on the line. Weak, scared, but unmistakably him. "Dino, don't do anything stupid, pal. These guys mean business. They've got me in some kind of warehouse. I can't see much, but I can hear." The line went dead. Dean Martin sat in his living room for the next 2 hours, staring at the phone, chain-smoking cigarettes, and facing the most difficult decision of his life. Option 1. Call the FBI. This was the logical choice. The FBI had resources, expertise, technology. They dealt with kidnappings all the time. But Dean knew the underworld well enough to know that involving law enforcement would probably get Frank killed. These weren't amateurs making empty threats. Option 2. Pay the ransom. Dean could probably raise $1 million between his own savings, loans against future earnings, and help from friends in the industry. The money was possible. But there was no guarantee the kidnappers would honor their word. And even if they did, what was to stop them from doing this again? Option 3. Go alone and try to rescue Frank himself. This was the most dangerous option, and probably the stupidest. Dean was an entertainer, not a soldier. He had no training in combat, no experience with violence, no plan beyond walking into an obvious trap. But Frank would do it for him. Dean knew that with absolute certainty. Dean Martin spent the next day making the most careful preparations of his life. First, he visited Mickey Cohen, a former mob boss who had gone semi-legitimate but still maintained contacts throughout the underworld. Mickey owed Dean several favors, and Dean called them all in at once. Vincent Torrino, Mickey said, shaking his head when Dean explained the situation. That's bad news, Dean. The man's desperate, which makes him dangerous, and he's got nothing left to lose. Can you find out where they're holding Frank? Mickey made some calls. By evening, he had an address. An abandoned airplane hangar at a private airfield 40 miles outside Las Vegas. Torrino was using it as a base of operations for smuggling goods across the desert. Dean, Mickey said seriously, if you're thinking of going in there alone, you're signing your own death warrant. These guys will kill you and Frank both. Then what do you suggest? Mickey was quiet for a long moment. Then you want my advice? Pay the ransom. At least then one of you has a chance. But Dean had already made his decision. The kidnappers had given Dean specific instructions. Drive alone to mile marker 47 on Highway 95, park and wait. Someone would contact him with further directions. Dean arrived at 11 p.m., exactly as instructed. The desert was eerily quiet, with nothing but the distant sound of wind and the occasional truck passing on the highway. At 11:15, a car approached. The driver got out and walked toward Dean's Cadillac. He was a big man, probably in his 40s, wearing a cheap suit that didn't quite fit his frame. You Dean Martin? The man asked. That's right. Where's Frank? Safe. For now, you bring the money? Dean held up a briefcase, but instead of $1 million, it contained newspaper cut to size and $20,000 in real bills on top. I want to see him first, Dean said. The man laughed. That's not how this works, singer boy. You give us the money, we give you your friend. Simple. And if I refuse, then we kill Sinatra and dump his body where no one will ever find it. Your choice. What happened next would become the stuff of legend among those who knew the true story. Dean Martin looked the kidnapper directly in the eyes and said, then I guess you better kill me too. Because if Frank dies, I'm going to spend every penny I have, every connection I've made, every favor I'm owed, hunting you and your boss down. And when I find you, I'm not calling the police. The kidnapper's confidence wavered slightly. You're bluffing, singer boy. You're soft. You people don't have the stomach for real violence. Dean smiled the same cool smile he used on stage, but there was something different behind his eyes. Something hard and final. Try me. For 30 seconds, the two men stared at each other in the desert darkness. Finally, the kidnapper spoke. Follow me. But any tricks, any surprises, and your friend dies. Understood? Understood. The abandoned airplane hangar was exactly as Mickey had described it. A massive, corrugated metal building surrounded by nothing but desert scrub and darkness. 3 cars were parked outside. Dean counted at least 6 men as he was led inside. The interior of the hangar was filled with wooden crates and shipping containers. Industrial lights hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor, and in the center of it all, tied to a chair, was Frank Sinatra. Frank looked terrible. His face was bruised, his shirt was torn, and dried blood crusted the side of his head. But his eyes were alert, and when he saw Dean, he managed a weak smile. Hey, Polly, Frank said. Thanks for coming to the party. Vincent Torrino stepped out from behind one of the shipping containers. He was shorter than Dean had expected, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and cold eyes that had seen too much violence. "So you're the famous Dean Martin," Torrino said. "Frank here's been telling us all about your friendship. How you'd do anything for each other. How you're like brothers." "That's right," Dean said calmly. "Good, because tonight we're going to test that brotherhood. Here's how this is going to work," Torrino said, circling Dean like a predator. "You give me the money, I let Frank go. You both walk out of here and forget this ever happened. And if I don't," Torrino smiled, "then I kill Frank in front of you. Then I kill you. Then I take the money anyway." Dean looked at Frank, who was trying to tell him something with his eyes. After 30 years of friendship, Dean could read Frank's expressions like sheet music. Frank was telling him not to do it, not to risk his life. But Dean had already made his choice. "All right," Dean said, setting the briefcase down. "But I want the ropes off Frank first." Show of good faith. Torrino nodded to one of his men who cut the ropes binding Frank to the chair. Frank rubbed his wrists and stood up shakily. "Now the money," Torrino said. Dean opened the briefcase. Torrino looked inside and his face immediately darkened. "What the hell is this? Newspapers? 20,000 on top," Dean said calmly. "The rest when Frank and I are safely out of here." Torrino's face turned purple with rage. "Do you think this is a game? Do you think I'm some amateur you can outsmart?" He pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at Dean's chest. "I should kill you right now for insulting me." "Then you'll never see the rest of the money," Dean said, "and you'll have 2 dead celebrities on your hands. How long do you think it'll take the FBI to track that back to you?" What Torrino didn't know was that Dean hadn't come completely unprepared. Mickey Cohen had given him more than just information about the warehouse location. He'd also given him a small transmitter device, military surplus from World War II, that would send a signal to a receiver 20 miles away. Dean had activated it the moment he walked into the warehouse. Mickey and 6 of his most trusted men were positioned around the building's perimeter. The plan was simple. If Dean didn't come out within 30 minutes, they would come in. But 30 minutes was a long time when men with guns were deciding whether to kill you. "Here's what's going to happen," Torrino said, his voice deadly calm. "One of you is going to die tonight. Maybe both. The only question is whether I get my money first." He looked back and forth between Dean and Frank. "You two are so close, so loyal. Let's see how deep that loyalty goes. Dean, I want you to choose. Either you kill Frank, or I kill both of you." He handed Dean a pistol. "Shoot your best friend in the head, and I'll let you walk out of here alive." Frank looked at Dean with complete trust. "Don't do it, Pally. Don't let this animal make you into something you're not." Dean took the gun. It was heavier than he'd expected. "I'm sorry, Frank," he said. At exactly that moment, the warehouse doors exploded inward. Mickey Cohen and his men stormed the building with military precision, automatic weapons blazing. The kidnappers, caught completely off guard, dove for cover behind the shipping containers. In the chaos, Dean tackled Frank to the ground, shielding him from the gunfire. Torrino, screaming in rage and frustration, turned his weapon toward the 2 entertainers. But before he could fire, Mickey Cohen put 3 bullets in his chest. The entire firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. When the smoke cleared, Vincent Torrino was dead. 2 of his men were wounded. The rest had surrendered. Frank and Dean were alive. At Sunrise Hospital, doctors treated Frank's concussion and various bruises while Dean sat in the waiting room, still shaking from adrenaline. "You're both lucky to be alive," the attending physician told them. "Mr. Sinatra, you have a mild concussion, but there doesn't appear to be any permanent damage." When they were alone, Frank looked at his friend with something close to awe. "Dino, what you did tonight? I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me, Frank. You would have done the same thing." "Yeah, but I might have gotten us both killed with some crazy scheme. You actually had a plan." Dean smiled. "Mickey had the plan. I just provided the distraction. You risked your life for me, and I'd do it again." The kidnapping incident was never reported in the newspapers. Mickey Cohen made sure that the surviving kidnappers understood the consequences of talking to reporters or police. Vincent Torrino's death was ruled a suicide. Officially, he'd been found alone in the warehouse with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But within the inner circles of Las Vegas and Hollywood, the story spread quickly. Dean Martin had risked everything to save Frank Sinatra. He'd walked into an obvious trap, bluffed men with nothing to lose, and come out alive through a combination of courage, planning, and sheer luck. The incident changed something fundamental in their relationship. 2 nights later, Dean and Frank were back on stage at the Sands, as if nothing had happened. But those who knew them well could see the difference. There was a new depth to their friendship, a recognition that they had been through something together that went beyond show business, beyond fame, beyond anything else in their lives. During their closing song that night, "The Lady is a Tramp," Frank stopped in the middle of a verse and looked directly at Dean. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank said to the audience, "I want you to know something about this man standing next to me. Dean Martin is the truest friend a guy could ask for. And that's not just showbiz talk. That's the real thing." The audience applauded, thinking it was just another piece of their stage banter. They had no idea how literally Frank meant every word. For the rest of their lives, Dean and Frank never spoke publicly about what happened that night in the desert. When reporters asked about their friendship, about their loyalty to each other, they would deflect with jokes and casual comments about watching each other's backs. But privately, the incident became the defining moment of their relationship. Frank would later tell his daughter Nancy, "Your Uncle Dean saved my life once, not metaphorically, literally. He walked into a place where he could have been killed just to get me out." Most people talk about friendship. Dean proved it. Dean, characteristically, was more modest in his assessment. When his son Dino asked him years later if the rumors about a kidnapping were true, Dean simply said, "Frank's my friend. Friends help each other out." The story of Frank Sinatra's kidnapping and Dean Martin's rescue became one of the most closely guarded secrets in Hollywood. Only a handful of people knew the complete truth. Mickey Cohen, Frank's daughter Nancy, Dean's son Dino, and the 2 men themselves. But the incident explained a lot about their relationship that fans had always wondered about. It explained why Frank always deferred to Dean during their performances, why he never pressured Dean to take jobs he didn't want, why their friendship seemed to have a depth that went beyond professional collaboration. It explained why, when Dean walked away from their reunion tour in 1988, Frank didn't try to stop him. Frank understood that Dean had already given him the greatest gift one friend could give another, his life. In December 1995, when Dean Martin was dying in his Beverly Hills home, Frank Sinatra called him one last time. They talked for 20 minutes about everything and nothing, about their families, their careers, their regrets. And finally, Frank brought up that night in 1962. "Dino, I never properly thanked you for what you did. Frank, we've been through this. No, listen to me. You saved my life, not just that night, but every day since. Knowing that someone cared enough to risk everything for me, that changed how I saw the world. That changed how I saw myself." Dean was quiet for a long moment. "Then we saved each other, Pally. That's what friends do." It was the last conversation they would ever have. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. Frank Sinatra was too ill to attend the funeral, but he sent a wreath with a card that read, "To my brother who showed me what courage looks like. Rest in peace, Dino." At the funeral, Frank's daughter Nancy read a statement from her father. "Dean Martin was the bravest man I ever knew. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he did the right thing even when he was terrified. He risked his life for me once, and I spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that sacrifice." The mourners assumed it was just Frank's way of honoring his friend's memory. They had no idea how literally true every word was. The story of Frank Sinatra's kidnapping reveals something profound about Dean Martin's character. Behind the cool exterior, behind the casual jokes and effortless charm, was a man of absolute loyalty and quiet courage. Dean Martin never sought credit for what he did that night. He never told the story to enhance his reputation or make himself look heroic. He simply did what he believed was right, without fanfare, without expectation of reward. That's what made him a true friend. That's what made him a hero. And that's why Frank Sinatra, one of the most powerful and complicated men in show business, trusted him completely. In a world of Hollywood phonies and fair-weather friendships, Dean Martin was the real thing. He proved it on a cold night in the Nevada desert when he risked everything to save the only man who understood him. The phone call that woke Dean Martin at 3:47 a.m. on November 15, 1962, could have been the beginning of a tragedy. Instead, it became the defining moment of the greatest friendship in entertainment history. Because sometimes, being a friend means more than just showing up for the good times. Sometimes, it means walking into the darkness when someone you love is trapped there. And Dean Martin never hesitated. Not for a second. That's what made him the king of cool. And that's what made him the truest friend Frank Sinatra ever had.